Richard Pemberton stepped out of his black limousine and looked up at his private jet, gleaming in the morning sun. At 68, he owned one of the biggest drug companies in the world. His medicines were in hospitals everywhere, and his bank account had more zeros than most people could count. Today felt special, though. He was flying to Geneva to speak at the biggest medical meeting of the year, and he wasn't traveling alone. 20 doctors were coming with him on this flight. These weren't just any doctors either. They were the best heart doctors, brain doctors, and emergency room doctors money could buy. Richard had invited them personally, paying for their flights and hotels. He liked being around smart people, especially ones who could keep him healthy. At his age, having the world's best doctors nearby felt like carrying a magic shield. "Good morning, Mr. Pemberton," said Captain Torres as Richard climbed the stairs to his jet. The plane was huge inside, with leather seats that cost more than most people's cars. Crystal glasses sat ready on polished wood tables, and fresh flowers decorated every corner. This wasn't just transportation. It was Richard's flying palace. The doctors were already settling into their seats, talking quietly among themselves. Dr. Martinez, a famous heart doctor from Boston, was reading through some papers. Dr. Chen, who had saved thousands of lives in emergency rooms, was checking messages on her phone. Dr. Williams, a brain surgeon who had written books that other doctors studied, was sipping coffee from a fine china cup. Richard felt proud watching them. These people had spent their whole lives learning how to save lives. They had studied for decades, worked countless hours, and earned respect around the world. And today they were all here because of him. If anything went wrong during the flight, he had 20 of the smartest medical minds in the world right there with him. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be taking off in about 10 minutes, announced the flight attendant. Her name was Patricia, and she had worked for Richard for 5 years. She knew exactly how he liked his coffee, and always made sure everything was perfect. As Richard walked toward his favorite seat at the front of the plane, he noticed a young girl sitting near the back with an older woman. The girl looked about 11 years old with bright, curious eyes and braided hair. She was reading a thick book that seemed too advanced for someone her age. "Who are they?" Richard asked Patricia quietly. "That's Mrs. Dorothy Johnson and her granddaughter Zara," Patricia explained. "Mrs. Johnson is a pediatric nurse who's been invited to speak at the nursing conference that's happening alongside your medical meeting. She's quite well known in her field." Richard nodded. He didn't mind having them on board. Mrs. Johnson was medical personnel even if she wasn't a doctor. And the little girl seemed quiet enough. He settled into his leather chair and pulled out his favorite fountain pen. It was a beautiful antique he had bought at an auction last year. The seller had told him it was over 100 years old and had belonged to a famous writer. Richard loved using it to sign important papers. There was something about writing with such an old, expensive pen that made him feel connected to history. The engines started humming, and soon they were racing down the runway. Richard looked out the window as New York City grew smaller below them. In a few hours he would be in Switzerland, standing in front of hundreds of doctors and medical researchers. He would tell them about his company's latest discoveries and the new medicines they were developing. But first he planned to enjoy this flight. The chefs had prepared his favorite meal, steak with roasted vegetables and a fine wine from his personal collection. He would eat, maybe take a nap, and arrive in Geneva feeling refreshed and ready. As they reached cruising altitude, the doctors began moving around the cabin, talking to each other about their work. Richard loved listening to their conversations. They spoke about surgeries they had performed, patients they had saved, and new techniques they were learning. It reminded him why he had gotten into the medicine business in the first place, to help people live better, healthier lives. Dr. Martinez stopped by Richard's seat. "Thank you again for arranging this trip," he said. "It's not often we get to travel in such comfort." "My pleasure," Richard replied, taking out his fountain pen to jot down a note. "I believe in surrounding myself with the best people. Smart people make everyone around them smarter." Young Zara was still reading her book, but Richard noticed she kept glancing up at the doctors when they talked. Her grandmother, Mrs. Johnson, was knitting something that looked like a small sweater. "What are you reading there?" Dr. Chen asked Zara as she walked past. "It's about different types of poisons and how they affect the human body," Zara replied without looking up. Dr. Chen raised her eyebrows. "That's pretty advanced reading for someone your age." Zara shrugged. "I want to be a doctor someday. Grandma says I should read everything I can get my hands on. Mrs. Johnson smiled proudly. This child has been reading medical textbooks since she was 8. She understands more about medicine than most adults. Richard found this amusing. A little girl reading about poisons on a plane full of doctors. He went back to his notes using his beautiful antique pen to write down ideas for his speech. The flight attendants began preparing lunch. The smell of perfectly cooked food filled the cabin. Richard felt completely relaxed and happy. Everything was going exactly as planned. He had his doctors around him, his business was thriving, and he was heading to one of the most important meetings of his career. He had no idea that in just a couple of hours, his perfect world would turn upside down. He couldn't have imagined that all 20 of his carefully chosen doctors would be helpless to save him. And he certainly never would have guessed that his life would depend on the sharp eyes and quick thinking of an 11-year-old girl sitting in the back of his plane. For now, though Richard Pemberton felt like the luckiest man in the world, flying high above the clouds with the best medical protection money could buy. 2 hours into the flight, Richard was enjoying the best steak he had tasted in months. The plane was flying smoothly at 35,000 feet and everyone seemed relaxed. The doctors were sharing stories about their most interesting cases, their voices mixing with the gentle hum of the engines. Richard took another bite of his perfectly cooked vegetables and reached for his fountain pen to write down a thought about his upcoming speech. The pen felt smooth in his fingers as he wrote. He had been using it all morning and loved how the ink flowed so easily across the paper. "This wine is excellent," commented Dr. Williams, raising his glass. "You have incredible taste, Richard." Richard smiled and was about to respond when something strange happened. The words seemed to stick in his throat. He tried to speak again, but instead of words, only a small cough came out. "Are you all right?" asked Dr. Martinez, who was sitting nearby. Richard touched his chest. There was a tight feeling there, like someone was slowly squeezing his lungs. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air didn't seem to want to go in properly. I'm not sure," Richard managed to say. His voice sounded different, weaker than usual. Dr. Martinez immediately moved closer. As a heart doctor, he had seen thousands of patients with chest problems. "Can you describe what you're feeling?" "My chest feels tight," Richard said, his breathing becoming more shallow. "And I feel dizzy." Within seconds, all 20 doctors had stopped their conversations and were focused on Richard. Dr. Chen quickly moved to check his pulse while Dr. Williams examined his eyes. With a small flashlight, his pulse is rapid and irregular, Dr. Chen announced. "Blood pressure is dropping." Richard felt panic rising in his chest. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now. And certainly not with 20 of the world's best doctors right beside him. He tried to stand up, but his legs felt weak and shaky. "Sir, please stay seated," said Dr. Peterson, a calm emergency room doctor. "We're going to take good care of you." Patricia, the flight attendant, quickly brought the plane's medical kit. Richard's private jet was equipped with more medical supplies than most small hospitals. There were heart monitors, oxygen tanks, and dozens of different medicines. Dr. Martinez attached a heart monitor to Richard's chest. The beeping sound filled the cabin, fast and irregular. The wavy lines on the small screen didn't look right even to Richard, who wasn't a doctor. "It's not showing signs of a typical heart attack," Dr. Martinez said, frowning at the monitor. Dr. Williams was checking Richard's reflexes with a small rubber hammer. Neurological responses seemed normal. No signs of stroke, but Richard was feeling worse by the minute. The tight feeling in his chest was getting stronger, and now he was having trouble catching his breath. His hands were shaking and he felt cold even though the cabin was warm. "Let's get him some oxygen," suggested Dr. Chen. She placed a clear plastic mask over Richard's nose and mouth. The oxygen felt good, but it didn't make the tight feeling go away. Dr. Rodriguez, a lung specialist, listened to Richard's breathing through a stethoscope. His lungs sounded clear, no signs of fluid or blockage. The doctors worked quickly, each using their special knowledge to try to figure out what was wrong. They checked his blood pressure again and again. They looked at his pupils with bright lights. They asked him dozens of questions about what he had eaten, what medicines he was taking, and how he had been feeling. That morning, "Have you had any chest pain before today?" asked Dr. Kim. "No, never," Richard gasped through the oxygen mask. "Any family history of heart problems?" "My father lived to 92, perfect health until the end. The doctors looked at each other with concerned expressions. Richard's symptoms didn't fit any of the usual patterns they knew. His heart was racing, but the rhythm wasn't typical of a heart attack. His breathing was labored, but his lungs sounded fine. His blood pressure was dropping, but there were no obvious signs of internal bleeding. "Let's try some nitroglycerin for the chest pain," suggested Dr. Martinez. This was a common medicine for heart problems. They gave Richard a small pill to put under his tongue. Usually this medicine helped heart patients feel better within minutes. But after 10 minutes, Richard felt the same, maybe even worse. "That should have helped if it was his heart," Dr. Chen said quietly to the other doctors. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, young Zara had stopped reading her book. She was watching everything that was happening with intense curiosity. Her grandmother, Mrs. Johnson, had also put down her knitting and was observing the medical team at work. "Poor man," Mrs. Johnson whispered. "I've never seen so many doctors look so confused." Richard's condition continued to get worse. His skin was starting to look pale, and there was a strange blue color around his fingernails. The doctors noticed this immediately. "Cyanosis," said Dr. Williams, pointing to the blue coloring. "He's not getting enough oxygen to his tissues." "But his oxygen levels are showing normal on the monitor," Dr. Peterson pointed out, looking at the digital display. This was very confusing. Usually, when someone's skin turned blue like that, it meant they weren't getting enough oxygen. But the machines were saying Richard's oxygen levels were fine. The doctors tried different medicines. They gave him something for anxiety in case stress was making things worse. They gave him medicine to slow down his racing heart. They even gave him steroids in case he was having some kind of allergic reaction. Nothing worked. If anything, Richard seemed to be getting worse. "I don't understand this," Dr. Martinez admitted to his colleagues. "I've been practicing cardiology for 30 years, and I've never seen symptoms quite like this." Richard could hear them talking, and their confusion made his panic even worse. If 20 of the world's best doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, what did that mean? His hands were shaking more now, and the blue color around his fingernails was getting darker. He felt like he was watching his own body failing, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Please," he whispered through the oxygen mask. "Help me." The doctors continued working frantically, trying every treatment they could think of. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that something very unusual was happening to Richard Pemberton, something that all their years of medical training hadn't prepared them for. In the back of the plane, 11-year-old Zara was still watching everything with her sharp, curious eyes, and she was starting to notice something that none of the brilliant doctors had seen. While the 20 doctors continued their frantic work around Richard, Zara sat quietly in her seat, her book forgotten in her lap. Her grandmother had taught her that sometimes the best way to learn was to watch and listen, especially when experts were working. But Zara wasn't just watching Richard. She was watching everything. The doctors were focused on the big things: heart monitors, blood pressure readings, oxygen levels, medicine reactions. They were asking important questions about Richard's medical history and checking all the major systems in his body. Zara understood why they were doing this. Her reading had taught her that doctors were trained to look for the most common and dangerous problems first. However, Zara's young mind worked differently. She noticed smaller details that the busy doctors might miss. She had been watching Richard even before he got sick. She saw him writing with his fancy fountain pen during takeoff. She noticed how he kept taking the pen out of his pocket throughout the flight, clicking it open and closed, spinning it between his fingers like a nervous habit. She saw the dark blue-black ink stains on his fingers and wondered why someone so rich and careful about his appearance didn't mind having messy hands. Now, as Richard struggled to breathe, Zara could see those same dark stains on his white shirt collar where he had been touching his neck. There were more stains on the armrest of his leather chair where his hand had been resting. The blue color around Richard's fingernails reminded her of something she had read about in her book on poisons. Many dangerous substances could cause that same blue discoloration, but it wasn't always from lack of oxygen like the doctors seemed to think. "Grandma," Zara whispered, tugging gently on Mrs. Johnson's sleeve. "Not now." "Sweetheart," her grandmother whispered back. "The doctors are working." But Zara couldn't stop thinking about what she had observed. In her book, she had read about a case where someone got very sick from old ink that contained toxic metals. The symptoms were similar to what she was seeing: trouble breathing, fast heartbeat, blue fingernails, and confusion. She looked at Richard's fountain pen, which had fallen on the floor during all the excitement. Even from her seat, she could see dark stains around the pen's tip. The ink wasn't just on Richard's hands anymore. It was everywhere he had touched. "Dr. Martinez," called out Dr. Chen. "His heart rate is getting even faster, but the rhythm is still irregular. This doesn't match any heart condition I know." "Could it be a rare genetic condition?" suggested Dr. Williams. "Or maybe some kind of unusual infection?" added Dr. Rodriguez. Zara listened to their guesses and felt frustrated. They were thinking of complicated diseases and rare conditions, but what if the answer was much simpler? What if Richard was being poisoned by something right there in plain sight? She remembered a story her grandmother had told her about the old days at the hospital where she worked. There had been a man who came in with strange symptoms that confused all the doctors. He was shaking, had trouble breathing, and his skin had turned an odd color. The doctors ran dozens of expensive tests and couldn't figure out what was wrong. Finally, a young nurse noticed that the man's fingers were stained with paint. It turned out he had been restoring an old house and using paint that contained lead and other dangerous chemicals. He was slowly poisoning himself every day and didn't even know it. "The pen," Zara said quietly to herself. She looked at her grandmother, who was watching the medical team with concern. Mrs. Johnson had worked in hospitals for 40 years. She had seen many strange cases and knew that sometimes the most obvious answer was the right one. "Grandma," Zara whispered more insistently, "I think I know what's wrong with him." This time, Mrs. Johnson looked down at her granddaughter. She knew Zara was incredibly bright and had an unusual understanding of medical topics for her age. "What do you mean, honey?" "His pen," Zara said, pointing toward Richard's fountain pen on the floor. "Look at all the ink stains on his hands and clothes. What if the ink in that old pen is poisonous?" Mrs. Johnson followed Zara's pointing finger and saw what her granddaughter meant. There were indeed dark stains everywhere Richard had touched. His hands, his clothes, his chair, even his coffee cup had dark smudges on it. That's actually not impossible," Mrs. Johnson said slowly. "Old inks used to contain all sorts of dangerous chemicals. Mercury, lead, arsenic, things that could make someone very sick. And look," Zara continued, "the blue color around his fingernails is getting worse. In my book, it said that metal poisoning can cause that exact symptom, and it doesn't always show up on oxygen monitors the way the doctors expect." Mrs. Johnson looked more carefully at Richard's condition. The symptoms Zara was describing did match some cases of heavy metal poisoning she had read about in nursing journals years ago. "The doctors are focused on his heart and lungs," Zara whispered urgently. "But what if those aren't the real problems? What if his body is being poisoned by chemicals from that pen, and that's why their medicines aren't working?" Mrs. Johnson felt a chill of recognition. Her granddaughter might be right. The doctors were treating Richard for heart problems and breathing problems, but if he was actually suffering from chemical poisoning, those treatments wouldn't help at all. They might even make things worse. She looked at the 20 brilliant doctors working frantically around Richard. They had decades of experience and advanced degrees. They had saved thousands of lives and earned respect around the world. But sometimes Mrs. Johnson knew experience could create blind spots. When you were trained to look for certain types of problems, you might miss something completely different. "Should we tell them?" Zara asked. Mrs. Johnson hesitated. She was just a nurse, not a doctor. And Zara was just a child. Would these important specialists listen to them? Would they take seriously a theory from an 11-year-old girl about ink poisoning? "They might not believe us," Mrs. Johnson said honestly. "But what if I'm right?" Zara replied. "What if he dies because nobody thought to look at the simple answer?" Mrs. Johnson looked at her granddaughter's determined face and then at Richard, who was clearly getting worse despite all the expert medical attention. "You're right," she said finally. "We have to try." The question was, how do you convince 20 world-famous doctors that they might be missing something obvious? And how do you do it quickly, before it's too late? Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath and stood up from her seat. She had worked in hospitals long enough to know that timing was everything in a medical emergency. Every second counted, and Richard was clearly running out of time. "Stay here for a moment," she told Zara, then walked toward the crowd of doctors surrounding Richard. The medical team was more frantic now. Richard's breathing had become even more labored, and the blue color around his fingernails was spreading. Dr. Martinez was adjusting the oxygen flow while Dr. Chen prepared another injection. "Excuse me," Mrs. Johnson said politely but firmly. Dr. Peterson glanced up briefly. "Ma'am, we're in the middle of a medical emergency. Please return to your seat." "I'm a pediatric nurse with 40 years of experience," Mrs. Johnson said, "and I think we might have an idea about what's happening." "We?" Dr. Williams looked confused. Mrs. Johnson gestured toward Zara. "My granddaughter has been observing, and she's noticed something you might want to consider." Several doctors exchanged glances. Dr. Martinez didn't even look up from Richard's monitor. "With all due respect, ma'am, we have 20 specialists here. We're handling this. But your treatments aren't working," Mrs. Johnson pointed out. "His condition is getting worse, not better." This statement hung in the air uncomfortably because it was absolutely true. Despite all their expertise and efforts, Richard was clearly declining. Dr. Chen stopped preparing her injection. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "My granddaughter thinks this might be chemical poisoning from his fountain pen." The silence that followed was awkward. Dr. Rodriguez actually laughed, though not unkindly. "A fountain pen? Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but that's not how medical diagnosis works." "Look at his hands," Mrs. Johnson persisted. "Look at the ink stains everywhere he's touched. That pen is old, possibly antique. Old inks contain dangerous chemicals like mercury and lead." Dr. Williams shook his head. "Even if that were true, ink poisoning from casual handling wouldn't cause symptoms this severe this quickly." "Unless he's been handling it constantly," said a small voice. Everyone turned to see Zara standing beside her grandmother. Her young face was serious and determined. "I've been watching him since we got on the plane," Zara continued. "He's been using that pen constantly. Writing notes, clicking it open and closed, spinning it in his fingers. The ink has been on his hands for hours, and he's been touching his face, his coffee cup, his food." Dr. Peterson looked annoyed. "Young lady, this is not a place for children to. What specific symptoms would you expect from heavy metal poisoning?" Zara interrupted, looking directly at him. Dr. Peterson was taken aback by the question. "Well, rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, cyanosis around the extremities. Like blue fingernails?" Zara asked. "Yes, but—" "And would those symptoms respond to typical heart medications?" Dr. Peterson hesitated. "Not necessarily, but—" "And would the oxygen saturation monitors give accurate readings if the problem was chemical interference with blood cells rather than lung function?" Now all the doctors were staring at Zara. Her questions were too sophisticated and too specific for a normal 11-year-old. Dr. Chen crouched down to Zara's eye level. "How do you know these things?" "I read medical books," Zara said simply. "I want to be a doctor someday, so I study everything I can find. Last month I read about a case from the 1800s where a writer got very sick from the ink in his fountain pen. The symptoms were exactly like what Mr. Pemberton has now." Dr. Martinez finally looked up from Richard's monitor. "Even if we considered this theory, how would we test it quickly? We don't have the equipment to test for heavy metal poisoning on a plane. But you could test the ink itself," Zara suggested. "And you could start treatment based on the symptoms instead of waiting for perfect confirmation." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward. "In emergency nursing, we sometimes had to treat suspected poisoning cases before we could confirm exactly what the poison was. The key was recognizing that standard treatments weren't working and being willing to try something different." Richard groaned weakly from his chair. His condition was clearly deteriorating, and the doctor's frustration was growing. Dr. Williams looked at his colleagues. "We've been working for an hour, and nothing we've tried has helped. His symptoms don't match any standard cardiac or pulmonary emergency. What would be the treatment for heavy metal poisoning?" Dr. Chen asked reluctantly. "Activated charcoal to absorb remaining toxins," Zara said immediately. "Have fluids to help flush the chemicals from his system. And possibly chelation therapy. Though I don't know if you'd have those medicines on the plane." Dr. Rodriguez picked up Richard's fountain pen from the floor and examined it more closely. It was indeed very old, with intricate metalwork and a design that suggested it was from the early 1900s or even older. "This is definitely antique," he said. "And look, the ink reservoir is leaking slightly. There are stains all around the mechanism." Dr. Martinez checked his watch. "We've been trying conventional treatments for over an hour with no improvement. If we're going to try something different, we need to do it soon. The activated charcoal won't hurt him even if we're wrong," Dr. Chen pointed out. "And IV fluids are standard supportive care anyway." Dr. Williams looked at Zara with new respect. You really think an 11-year-old girl figured out something that 20 experienced doctors missed? I think, Zara said quietly, that sometimes fresh eyes see things that experienced eyes miss. You were all looking for complicated diseases, but maybe the answer was simple and right in front of us the whole time. Mrs. Johnson put her hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. She's been trained to observe details and ask questions. Sometimes that's more valuable than years of seeing the same patterns over and over. The doctors looked at each other, then at Richard, who was clearly running out of time. They had reached a moment where they needed to decide. Stick with their expert training that wasn't working, or listen to an 11-year-old girl who might have seen something they all missed. Dr. Martinez made the decision. Let's try it. Get the activated charcoal and prepare IV fluids for chelation support. We can't keep doing the same things and expecting different results. As the medical team quickly shifted to this new approach, Zara felt both nervous and hopeful. She might be wrong, and if she was, she would feel terrible. But if she was right, her willingness to speak up despite being dismissed might save a life. The next few minutes would tell them whether sometimes wisdom really could come from the most unexpected places. The change in the cabin was immediate. Where there had been growing panic and frustration, now there was focused purpose. Dr. Chen quickly prepared activated charcoal while Dr. Martinez set up an IV line in Richard's arm. Dr. Williams contacted the pilot to request priority landing at the nearest airport with a major hospital. How much activated charcoal? Dr. Chen asked. Standard dose for suspected poisoning, replied Dr. Peterson, who despite his initial skepticism was now fully committed to trying Zara's theory. They gave Richard the black chalky mixture to drink. It wasn't pleasant, but he managed to get it down. The activated charcoal would work like a sponge inside his stomach, absorbing any remaining toxins before they could get into his bloodstream. Next came the IV fluids. These would help flush his system and support his kidneys as they worked to eliminate the toxic chemicals from his body. How long before we should see improvement? Dr. Rodriguez asked. If it's really chemical poisoning, we should see some stabilization within 15 to 30 minutes, Mrs. Johnson said. The IV fluids will start helping immediately, and the activated charcoal will prevent any further absorption. Zara watched nervously from her seat. Everyone was now committed to her theory, but what if she was wrong? What if she had convinced 20 brilliant doctors to waste precious time on a wild guess from a kid? His heart rate is still elevated, Dr. Martinez reported, watching the monitor. That might take longer to improve, Zara said quietly. The book I read said that once heavy metals get into the bloodstream, it can take time for the symptoms to reverse, even with treatment. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Richard's breathing seemed slightly easier, but his heart was still racing and the blue color around his fingernails remained. Some of the doctors began exchanging worried glances. Had they made a mistake listening to a child? Then, at the 20-minute mark, something changed. Wait, said Dr. Chen, looking at the heart monitor. His rhythm is starting to regularize. Dr. Martinez checked Richard's blood pressure. It's coming up. Still low, but definitely improving. Richard himself was the first to notice the biggest change. I can breathe, he whispered, his voice stronger than it had been in an hour. The tightness in my chest is getting better. A wave of relief swept through the cabin. The doctors looked at each other with amazement, then turned to look at Zara with newfound respect. The blue color around his nails is starting to fade too, observed Dr. Williams. By the 30-minute mark, Richard's improvement was undeniable. His heart rate had dropped to nearly normal levels, his breathing was much easier, and the frightening blue discoloration was almost gone. He was sitting up straighter and could speak in full sentences again. How do you feel, Mr. Pemberton? Dr. Chen asked. Like I'm coming back to life, Richard said honestly. An hour ago I thought I was dying, and now I actually feel human again. Dr. Martinez turned to Zara. Young lady, I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you a debt of gratitude. One by one, the other doctors came over to shake Zara's hand and thank her. These were some of the most accomplished medical professionals in the world, and they were thanking an 11-year-old girl for saving their patient's life. How did you know to look at the pen? Dr. Rodriguez asked. I was just watching everything, Zara explained. You were all focused on the important medical stuff, which made sense. But I noticed he kept playing with that pen and there were ink stains everywhere. When I saw the blue color around his fingernails, it reminded me of the heavy metal poisoning case I had read about. But why didn't we think of that? Dr. Peterson wondered aloud. Mrs. Johnson smiled. Because you're experts. You've been trained to look for the most common and most dangerous conditions first. That's good medicine most of the time. But sometimes the answer is something simple and unusual that doesn't fit the normal patterns. Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. We were thinking about heart attacks, strokes, infections, genetic conditions, all the serious things that could cause these symptoms. We never considered that he might be poisoning himself with his own pen. Richard was feeling well enough now to participate in the conversation. You mean this pen nearly killed me? He asked, looking at the antique fountain pen that Dr. Rodriguez still held. It looks like the ink contains dangerous levels of heavy metals, Dr. Chen explained. Probably mercury, lead, maybe arsenic. Old inks often contained these chemicals. You've been absorbing small amounts through your skin every time you handled it. But I only bought it last year, Richard protested. The pen might be antique, but someone could have filled it with historically accurate ink, Dr. Martinez suggested. Or maybe the original ink was still in there and had become more concentrated over time. Richard shook his head in amazement. I spent millions of dollars on the best medical care money could buy. I brought 20 world-class doctors with me on this flight. And the person who saved my life was... He looked at Zara with wonder. How old are you? 11, Zara said shyly. All the attention was making her a bit uncomfortable. 11 years old, Richard repeated, and you figured out what we couldn't. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Geneva. Mr. Pemberton, there will be an ambulance waiting to take you to the hospital for further evaluation, just as a precaution. Richard nodded. He felt much better, but he understood the wisdom of getting checked out by doctors who had equipment to properly test for and treat heavy metal poisoning. As they prepared for landing, Richard called Zara and her grandmother over to his seat. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You saved my life. I just noticed something and spoke up, Zara said modestly. That took courage, Richard replied. It's not easy for anyone to challenge experts, especially for someone your age. But you did it anyway because you thought it was right. He paused, thinking, You said you want to be a doctor someday? Zara nodded. Well, when you're ready for medical school, you call me. I'll make sure you get into the best program in the world. And when you graduate, if you want to work in medical research, you'll have a job waiting for you at my company. Zara's eyes went wide. Really? Really, Richard said firmly. The world needs doctors who can think differently, who notice things others miss, and who have the courage to speak up even when it's difficult. As the plane touched down in Geneva, Richard reflected on the irony of his situation. He had spent his entire career in the medical field, surrounded himself with the best doctors money could buy, and nearly died from something as simple as a pen. But more than that, he had learned something important about wisdom and knowledge. Sometimes the most valuable insights came not from degrees and experience, but from fresh eyes, careful observation, and the willingness to consider that the obvious answer might be the right one. The 20 doctors had saved thousands of lives between them, but today they had all learned something, new from an 11-year-old girl who simply paid attention to details and wasn't afraid to ask questions. As the ambulance, doors closed and Richard headed to the hospital for final tests. He made a mental note for his speech the next day. He would tell the medical conference about the importance of listening to all voices, regardless of age or credentials, and how sometimes the most profound discoveries came from the most unexpected sources. After all, Zara had just proved that wisdom could come from anywhere, even from a curious kid sitting in the back of an airplane.